Okay. So firstly, let me thank the organisers for inviting me to speak on behalf of the International Labour Organization. I think I should begin firstly by maybe just explaining who and what the International Labour Organization actually is. It's an agency of the United Nations, although it was originally established actually in 1919 as part of the post-First World War settlement. It was integrated into the United Nations system after the Second World War in 1946. And its objective is essentially to promote what is termed decent work for all women and men. So decent work is kind of quite a broad idea, but it's been, for programmatic purposes within the ILO, divided into 4 ideas which are listed on the PowerPoint, which is essentially fundamental principles and rights, employment promotion, social protection, that's to say pension rights and unemployment benefits, so on and so forth, medical benefits, and then social dialogue, which is to ensure that workers, employers and governments you talk to each other and reach consensus as to what is the best way forward in terms of promoting. So the social dialogue then is so that the workers organisations, namely trade unions, employers organisations and governments, can reach consensus as to which is the best way forward to promote decent work in all the different components. So uniquely within the United Nations system, the members of the ILO are not just governments, albeit we have 185 member states, but we also have 185 trade unions and 185 employers organisations. Obviously, whatever the umbrella organisation for trade unions or employers organisations is in a particular country. Now I'm going to look in particular while all those the four aspects of decent work are very relevant to the promotion of LGBT rights, it's actually probably the most important one is fundamental principles and rights, which is essentially refers to international labour standards or international labour conventions and recommendations. And in 1998, it was declared that 8 of those conventions are of particular importance, covering 4 areas of work. So they're called the fundamental conventions, and they essentially cover the eradication of the worst forms of child labour, the eradication of forced labour, the promotion of freedom of association and collective bargaining, and probably most relevant for our purposes here today, the eradication or at least reduction of discrimination in the workplace. And in terms of discrimination in the workplace, the relevant convention is Convention 111, which was came into being in 1958. So obviously, given that the year in question, 1958, discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity is not explicitly in the convention. So it's not one of the 7 grounds that are stated in the convention on which signatories are forbidden or must do everything to stop discrimination on those grounds. However, things have moved, because one of the things that Convention 111 does do in one of the clauses is it leaves the door open for new grounds of discrimination to be included under the remit of the convention. And probably the first time sexual orientation or gender identity emerged in any ILO context at all was the 1996 survey on equality in employment and occupation, which essentially examined adherence to Convention 111, the Discrimination Convention. And it cited sexual orientation, and I quote, as an emerging motive for discrimination. This was followed up in reports of 2003, 2007, and 2011, whereby the ILO looked at how, essentially in each of those years, looked at how Convention 111 and Convention 100 on equal pay, but let's focus for the moment on Convention 111. It looked at how those conventions were being implemented globally, and it included looking at specifically discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So, in a sense, starting back in 1996, things started to move relatively rapidly. In that, now as of today, if you recall, I mentioned that the convention leaves open the option for member states to include new grounds on which discrimination is prohibited. And as of today, 60 ILO member states have added sexual orientation and gender identity as an outlawed form of discrimination in employment under Convention 111. So that's just some of the legalistic background to the emergence of the ILO focusing on sexual orientation and gender identity as a relevant area of discrimination that falls within our remit. From a more public relations and image perspective, I think the 17th of May 2012, which of course, as you all know, is the International Day for the elimination of homophobia and transphobia. For the first time in 2012, the ILO's Director General made a statement, both in front of a microphone in the ILO's governing body room, but also up on the website, where he declared that the ILO, it was a longer statement than is here, but he declared that the ILO is committed to fighting all forms of discrimination in the world of work, including discrimination rooted in homophobia and transphobia. So it was the first time that it had been mentioned from the very top. And similarly, on the 17th of May this year, our now new Director General made a similar statement. So we're hoping that it will be each year on the 17th of May, the Director General will make a point of declaring that this is part of the ILO's mandate, and we do not tolerate discrimination in the workplace on the basis of SOGI. Now, the bureau I work in, the Bureau for Gender Equality, within the ILO, obviously the focus of our work, the primary focus of our work is equality between women and men in the world of work, to which we're trying to apply a LGBT perspective across the board now. But more specifically, we put in a proposal to the Norwegian government in 2011 to run a project specifically, which looked specifically at LGBT rights in the workplace. It was kind of, to be honest, at the time, not something we thought would succeed, because we spend a lot of our time doing up proposals for different donors, and many of them fail. But this one, luckily did not fail. So we obviously our timing was obviously right, in that the government of Norway have given us €600,000 to look at discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So to research it. The reason why it's, for the moment, uniquely research focused without any advocacy component is that as things stand, the ILO's governing body have never given any guidance on this topic. So as officials of the ILO, we're obviously limited by the mandate given to us by the governing body, which is comprised of governments, trade unions, and employers' organizations. However, we can investigate discrimination on the basis of SOGI. In a sense, I suppose on some level we're doing it somewhat below the radar for the moment. But so the research, the selection of countries for the research was done. There was a number of criteria used. Firstly, I think one of the former speakers mentioned that consensual sexual acts between same-sex people is outlawed in something, I think, 76 countries of the world. So we decided not to look at not to do the research in any of those countries, just for practical purposes, that it would be impossible. And actually, we probably could have got us ourselves individually and the International Labour Organization into a lot of difficulty. We also tried to have a regional spread. If you notice, the 4 countries being Argentina, Hungary, South Africa, and Thailand, they're spread across sort of the 4 main regions of the world. So the idea was to get as many different perspectives on this as we could. And also we did it in consultation with the regional offices, the ILO regional offices in those areas, as to which would be good, which would be countries where, firstly, this research would receive some kind of welcome, in that obviously the research it's based on focus groups and based on interviews with workers, interviews with employers. So there needs to be, the doors would have to be open on some level for us to be able to actually conduct the research. So the research looks at, the methodology of the research looks, if you remember from the previous slide when I explained what decent work was, so it looks at the legal system, that's to say the fundamental principles and rights. It looks at employment promotion, so whether LGBT issues or SOGI issues are integrated into employment policy in any way. It looks at social protection, so that's to say primarily what we're looking at there is whether same-sex couples have the same rights to medical benefits, pension entitlements, and social protection in a broad sense as heterosexual couples. And then finally looks at social dialogue, so the extent to which, well, firstly, at the attitudes or the views of government, trade unions, and employers' organisation on LGBT issues, and the extent to which LGBT issues come up, if at all, in the collective bargaining process. So when when governments, workers, and employers sit down together to work out wages or different aspects of the employment relationship, whether indeed LGBT is on the agenda. Just to give you some brief overview of initial findings from the research. Although before I do that, I should mention that phase 2 now, where the research in the first 4 countries is, broadly speaking, finished. I mean, it's finished completely in Thailand and Hungary, and it is being completed as we speak in Argentina and South Africa. And we're about to then launch into another phase of research in 3 new countries, which is Honduras, Indonesia, and Montenegro. Again, chosen in collaboration with the regional offices. So the general findings, I don't think these will come as any surprise to anybody. I think I was speaking with one of the other speakers before, and in many respects a lot of social science research tends to confirm things you suspected anyway, and this is an example of that. But nonetheless, obviously it's important to have some empirical data So the first finding, most obvious finding, is that discrimination against LGBT workers does exist, and it often exists on the basis of workers' perceived sexual orientation. That's to say, it's not necessarily because the person is gay or the person is a lesbian or the person is bisexual, but largely because other workers suspect that they are, because of particular behavior that they have in the workplace. And that can be a cause of discrimination, and in many cases actually more than that, and it can be a cause of harassment. The second main finding is that in many cases the laws are actually, there's no law at all. I mean, there's general human rights and discrimination law, but that often doesn't explicitly mention discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And even when the laws do exist, they're often poorly applied. What emerged from our focus groups is that the majority of LGBT workers remain in what's called in English in the closet, so they don't go public about their sexual orientation at work. Largely for the reason, the obvious reason of the first finding, that discrimination, they see that discrimination exists. Discrimination and harassment against gay people and lesbian people exists. So therefore, they choose to keep it secret because of fear of that discrimination. So it's not particularly complicated. And then finally, a finding this transgender workers' experience of discrimination is the most severe, to the extent that in most of the countries we looked at, Thailand and Argentina being to some extent an exception, but certainly in Hungary and South Africa, transgender workers are entirely excluded from the labour force completely, almost entirely. So as I said, I mean, the findings will probably, they're not groundbreaking or major shock. They're largely confirming probably what most people would have expected. Okay, to bring it more related to the topic of today's conference, which is more looking at it in the context of family units. So obviously we looked at, as I mentioned, social protection was one of the things we looked at. And same-sex partners are rarely entitled to social security benefits. I mean, it's different in Argentina and South Africa. Both countries have marriage equality, so in that sense there's an exception there. But in the other two countries, Hungary and Thailand, there's no recognition of medical pension benefits for same-sex partners. Parental leave for same-sex couples is even rarer, although that's, as we all probably know, that's not uniquely a problem for same-sex couples. The idea of parental leave, or the idea of real efforts being made by workplaces to balance work and family life, is something that affects all parents, I think, not just, but I think the challenges for same-sex parents are more severe. As an interesting aside on that, even within the United Nations, and the ILO being included in that, the recognition of same-sex partnership is dependent on your nationality. So it's dependent on the nationality of the UN official. So for example, me as an Irish national, if I were in a same-sex partnership, the ILO would give pension benefits, dependency allowance, child benefits and medical benefits to my partner, given that Ireland has instituted civil partnerships for same-sex couples. However, were I from a country that did not, such as Malawi or even Italy, correct me if I'm wrong, the same-sex partner would not be entitled to those benefits based on the nationality of the individual. Now that's something that within the staff union of the ILO we're actively campaigning against, because it's basically discrimination on the basis of the nationality of the worker, which is, is within the UN would seem to be quite an odd thing it's quite an odd principle to attempt to uphold within an international organization, particularly an international organization that's committed to eliminating discrimination on all grounds, including on the basis of sexual orientation. But it's even in the final point there, when there's one of the conventions is one of the lesser ratified conventions, it should be said, is of the ILO's Convention 156, which is on workers with family responsibilities, and it basically takes cognizance of the fact that workers also have family responsibilities, and that the workplace should make account of that in terms of how it structures the time the workers have to be there, and so on and so forth. But even within the convention, it talks of that account being taken of national conditions. So again, it's sort of an out clause for countries that don't want to recognise same-sex partnerships or so on and so forth. So it's even within one of the ILO's conventions, there's that same discrimination on the basis of nationality to some degree. But I mean, just to finish up, I think for me, and I think for the bureau in which I work generally, and I think for the ILO, the significant thing in many respects is that we are doing this research. The fact that the ILO is actually working on LGBT workers' rights and proactively working on it with a specific project, and actually one full-time employee, not me, it's a colleague of mine working specifically on a day-to-day basis on this. I mean, that's probably 10 years ago that would never have seemed like a realistic proposition. And just recently, we just had our governing body in October, and I think the paper is within your folders. We wrote and presented a paper to the governing body on the general findings of our research that I've just described. Now, the paper was simply for information, because there's 3 levels of paper that can go before the governing body. There's for information, for debate and guidance, or for decision. So we figured a for information paper would be a good way to start. So it's literally just for the information of the delegates. The idea being to hopefully provoke some debate within the governing body, to at least bring the topic onto their agenda, which could then, maybe a year or 2 later, they could ask us for a paper for debate and guidance, which of course would then give us as ILO officials the chance to be more proactive than simply just carrying out research. We could actually then do advocacy and training. However, it was completely ignored, the paper. There wasn't a single reaction to it in the governing body. The only reaction we did have to it was in the build-up to the governing body, where the Africa group objected to it being presented. We received a letter from the Africa group of the governing body saying they didn't feel this fell within the ILO's mandate and shouldn't be on the agenda. In one sense, we were hoping they would say that in the governing body, which they chose not to, because had they actually said that in the governing body itself, we would hope at least that some other governments might have come out and said, well, actually, we do think it should be on the agenda, and at least it would have started some debate. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. So for the moment, that's where we are in terms of, it's very, as you can probably tell from my presentation, it's very early stages. And we've just, as of January last year, started our first project on this issue. But we're hoping that it'll be the start of something that'll over time grow bigger. That's certainly our strategy. Norway, we're hoping will continue to fund us to do it. And we've also had interest from the government of Sweden and from the government of the United States as well, that they're interested in pursuing this. So I'll leave it there. I mean, there's lots more I could say, but I think when we come back to the questions and answer session, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Okay, thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank a comrade who has been also a militant. He is Senator Lo Giudice, who is now a member of our parliament, who is not part of the professional politicians who are not here, which I referred to in the beginning. Let me thank Ms. Cannevari from UNAR, and also Vanni Piccolo from UNAR as well, who is another long-standing militant himself. And all other participants for being here. Let me now invite you to take a short coffee break. And as short as possible coffee break, because there are many speakers left on our agenda. So we will resume at 11:40.